Hello and welcome to Pathology Decoded. I am Dr. Rana, your guide through this platform that breaks down complex medical concepts into easy to grasp bites, helping students like you ace your exams. If you're here watching this video, I believe that you are looking for a way to understand and retain pathology better, and I'm going to help you do just that. If you watch this video till the end, please share your thoughts in the comment section. Your feedback fuels future content. Now let's dive in and make pathology accessible and enjoyable. Today's topic is necrosis. Necrosis is a word derived from Greek word necros, which means a dead body. So what actually is necrosis? Necrosis is a form of cell injury that results in the premature death of cells in a living tissue. So here we have got normal cell, number of cells which are present in a tissue, and whenever there is necrosis, they undergo irreversible cell injury and die. So this cumulative death of these cells is what we call as necrosis. So what is the etiology of necrosis? The etiology of the necrosis is same as the cell injury. So all those things which were causing cell injury are responsible for necrosis. I have already covered these etiologies in cell injury in my first video, which is based upon reversible and irreversible cell injury. If you want to know about these etiologies in details, then you can go and check that video. I will post the link in the descriptive section also, or you can click it from here and watch that video for the details of these etiologies. Here I will briefly discuss them. That the most common cause of necrosis is oxygen deprivation, or what we call as hypoxia, which is usually caused by ischemia. And the common cause for ischemia is the arterial obstruction. The common one is atherosclerosis, which causes the narrowing of the lumen of the artery. Then it could be due to cardiorespiratory failure, where their heart is failing, or where proper oxygen transfusion and exchange of the gases does not occur in the lungs. Other causes which can lead to necrosis are severe anemia or carbon monoxide poisoning, which can lead to tissue death. Then we have got physical causes of uh, necrosis or the cell injury. These include mechanical trauma, burns and deep colds, sudden changes in atmospheric pressure, particularly on the person who go to the high altitude very fast, or deep sea divers who go very deep at a very high atmospheric pressure. And then we have got radiation, which could be due to ultraviolet radiation, or it could be due to X-rays or CT scans, or it could be due to some accidents like nuclear fallout, example being Chernobyl reaction. Then we have got chemical agents and drugs, which include high glucose concentration or hypertonic saline, which are used in treating the patients. Poisons like arsenic, cyanide, mercuries, alcohol, air pollution, insecticides, and herbicides. Then we have infectious agents, which include bacteria, viruses, fungi, parasites. And finally, we have got immunological reactions, which could be external agents like viruses or allergens, etc., or they could be self-antigens in the autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, type 1 diabetes, SLE, etc. Now, all these are responsible for necrosis and constitute the etiology of cell death or necrosis. Now, let's discuss the morphological types of the necrosis. The necrosis, whenever it occurs, the cell will or the tissue will present in a certain manner, both grossly as well as the microscopically. That means when you will be looking at the tissue, you will see certain characteristic features which will tell, okay, this type of necrosis occurred. or when you see it under the microscope, you can say this particular type of necrosis was involved. Now, this morphological types of necrosis depends upon two conditions. One is enzymatic cell digestion, that means which types of enzymes and how much of those enzymes were involved in causing the death of the cell. And the second is the way in which protein denaturation occurs. So the contents of the cells, they are digested by the enzymes which are also present in the cells or in the surrounding cells, and the proteins of the cells undergo denaturation in a particular manner depending upon again two things. One is the etiological agent affecting the cell death, whether the cell death occurred due to hypoxia, or it occurred due to physical trauma, or it occurred due to some chemical agents, or it occurred due to some immunological reactions. Depending upon that, the tissue will present in a particular morphological pattern whenever necrosis occurs. And then second depends upon the nature of tissue involved in the injury. What type of tissue was involved? How solid the tissue was? How much of the vascularity was present in the tissue? What type of content of the tissue was there? Whether it constituted too much of fat or too much of protein or too much of stromal tissue. So depending upon these things, necrosis will present in five types, five common types or five common patterns. The first pattern is the coagulative necrosis. Second one is liquefactive necrosis. Third is caseous necrosis. Fourth, fat necrosis. And finally, we have got a fibrinoid necrosis. So these five patterns of necrosis are involved in uh, whenever there is a tissue death occurring. Now let's take them up one by one. First one is the coagulation necrosis. This coagulative necrosis occurs when the tissue proteins denature due to ischemia or hypoxia. So, what is the cause of coagulative necrosis, or what is the etiology? The etiology is hypoxia, which could be due to ischemia or cardiorespiratory failure. Any of these conditions which will lead to obstruction of blood supply to the tissue will lead to cell death. And when multiple cell dies in the tissue, we call necrosis. That necrosis will be labeled as coagulative necrosis. So, what are the sites involved in this type of necrosis? The common sites involved are solid organs like heart, kidney, and liver. Although it can occur in any part of the body, but these are the organs which are most commonly involved due to necrosis occurring because of the hypoxia in these organs. Now, grossly, how will the tissue look like? So, if we see gross appearance means that when we look at the tissue with our naked eyes, it it will appear in a certain manner. So, what will be the pattern? What will we see? So, when the early stages of death has occurred, the tissue will be swollen. Remember when I told you in the reversible and irreversible cell injury that due to failure of the ATP pump, the cell swells. The cellular swelling is the first sign of the tissue injury. So, whenever the death will occur, the cells in the early stages they will be swollen, but in the late stages, as the time progresses, the tissue will become shrunken. It will become yellow and shrunken because there will be loss of the blood from that area. It will become yellow, and all that fluid part from that will be taken away by the body. So that will lead to shrinking of the tissue. So here we see that in early stages, when the early death has occurred, the tissue will be swollen, and in the later stages, the tissue will be shrunken. Now, what will we see if we look it under the microscope or in the microscopic appearance? Now, in microscopic appearance, the nuclei become shrunken with loss of details. That means nuclei become pycnotic. This is called as pycnosis. Again, remember three types of nuclear death I had explained in my earlier lectures. It was pycnosis, there was karyolysis, and karyorexis. So here in coagulative necrosis, there will be clumping of the chromatin material, which is now called as pycnosis. Secondly, the cytoplasm becomes eosinophilic. That means the cytoplasm of the cells which have died because of coagulative necrosis, it will become pinkish in color. Eosinophilic means that it will bind with the eosin stain, and so under the microscope it will appear pinkish in color. So here you can see that this area, this is a part of the tissue which has undergone coagulative necrosis, and that is appearing reddish in color, and the surrounding area, which is the normal tissue over here, this is bluish in color. And why is this eosinophilic? Why is this pinkish in color? Because it has lost its basophilia, which means that the acidic material inside the cell, which had the ability to bind with the basic dye, now that is no more present. So, what was the acidic material inside the cytoplasm? That was cytoplasmic RNA. So, you know that in the cytoplasm of the cells, we have got transfer RNA, which is involved in protein synthesis, and these RNA, they are acids, ribonucleic acids, and they are responsible for the bluish color of the cell. As well as in the nucleus also, we have got what we say as DNA and RNA. So with the cell death, they are lost, so the acidic content of that cell is lost, and so it loses its basophilia, and hence it appears pinkish in color. Now, the characteristic of coagulative necrosis is that the cellular outlines are preserved. The cells, their details is lost. Whatever inside the cell that is not visible, it becomes all lost, but the outlines of the cells, they remain. That means that cell do not dissolve. They remain as the empty shells of themselves, and that we call as cells become their own tombstones. Okay, or we call that cells become ghost cells. So when we see look at a ghost, what do we know? We come to know that it is a ghost of a man or a woman outline, but you cannot see the details of that ghost. So that's why these cells are called as ghost cells, or the cells become their own tombstones. What does this mean? Now here, whenever you go to a graveyard, you see the tombstone. You do not know which dead body is lying in this grave because you cannot look at the dead body, but then you know that okay, this grave belongs to so and so person. How is that possible? Because there is a tombstone, and on the tombstone it is written that so and so beloved, and this from this period to this period is the one who is lying in this grave. So by reading that tombstone, you come to know whose grave it is. Same way, by looking at the outline of the cells, you come to know to which tissue they belonged. So here you see, we have got liver tissue, and the cells have got certain shape. Over here we see that the cells have lost their details. Now here you can see there is a nuclei inside, there are cytoplasmic vacuoles, there are cytoplasmic contents, etc. But over here you see that the cells, they have become faded. But still, looking at the outline, you can very clearly tell that these cells belong to so and so tissue. That means you are able to tell to which tissue these cells belonged. So you can identify them, just like you identify the dead body within the grave by looking at the tombstone. So cells themselves are telling, see, I belong to this tissue. You might not know, you cannot see me, I have become faded, but look at my outlines, look at my shape, and this is the tissue which I belong. So you will be able to tell whether it is a dead hepatocyte, or it is a dead renal cell, or it is a dead myocardial muscle. By looking at the shape of the cells, you can tell to which tissue it belongs. That is the characteristic of the coagulative necrosis. So the cells, they become ghost cells, or they become their own tombstones. Now, what are the clinical conditions in which coagulative necrosis is seen? The common clinical condition, one is myocardial infarction, which is very commonly, and in the layman terms, it is called as heart attack. And the another is the renal infarction, when the blood supply to the kidney decreases. Then we have got liquefactive necrosis. Now, liquefactive necrosis occurs when tissue undergoes rapid dissolution due to the action of hydrolytic enzymes. For example, proteases. So, the cells, lysosomes, they contain digestive enzymes like proteases, like collagenases, and various other enzymes. These enzymes, they are hydrolytic. That means they dissolve, they dissolute the structure to watery form, and these are responsible for liquefactive necrosis. It is also called as colliquative necrosis. Now, liquefactive necrosis, as the name suggests, that tissue becomes liquefied. And what is the etiology? The common etiology for necrosis is bacterial or fungal infections. So these bacteria, particularly, they are known as pyogenic bacteria or the pus generating bacteria. So what is pus? Pus is those dead cells which have become liquefied. So pus is liquid form. So over here the cells, they become liquefied, and that's why it is called liquefactive necrosis. Only one thing is that in the brain, when ischemia occurs, there occurs liquefactive necrosis. So this is a important point, and you have to keep this in your mind that ischemia, as we studied in the coagulative necrosis, ischemia causes coagulative necrosis except in the brain. So in brain, ischemia will cause liquefactive necrosis. Otherwise, elsewhere in the body, it will cause coagulative necrosis. Now, a question will come in your mind: why? Why does this so happen? Now, this is probably because brain cells, neurons, and glial cells, which are over there, they are highly sensitive to oxygenation deprivation, and in these cells, Ischemia leads to rapid energy depletion. So, leading to the dysfunction of the ion pumps, and this disrupts the cell membrane integrity, and so the cells become damaged, as well as the enzymes are released which lead to the liquefaction of the brain tissue. So brain tissue being soft and full of enzymes, etc., and very sensitive to hypoxia and leading to cell membrane damage, it becomes liquefied. So in brain, ischemia causes liquefactive necrosis, while in rest of the body ischemia causes coagulative necrosis. Many MCQs are based upon this question, that and you keep in mind that the common cause of coagulative necrosis is ischemia. This is a exception. Brain is a exception. In brain, liquefactive necrosis occurs due to ischemia. Never forget that. Now, what are the sites involved for liquefactive necrosis? So common sites, they are brain, liver, skin, and soft tissue, all because of bacterial or fungal infection. Now, gross appearance. Grossly, when we look at the tissue, the affected tissue becomes soft, liquefied, and forms a cystic cavity. So here we have a brain abscess. Here you see that over in this region there is a cystic cavity. So there is some cavity formed which is filled with liquefied material, and of course, if you touch it, it will be very soft to touch. Microscopically, when we look at the tissue, that cystic area which was over here, it contains necrotic cell debris and macrophages which are filled with phagocytized material. So what happens? The phagocytic cells come over here and they try to engulf the dead cells. So they cytoplasm is filled with those dead necrotic debris, and the surrounding area contains inflammatory cells and the fibrotic tissue. So here you see in the surrounding area, here in the center, there is all inflammatory cells and macrophages present. And they are almost in a liquefied form. The cell have died and they become liquefied, and now they are being phagocytized by the inflammatory cells, by the macrophages over here. And in the surrounding area, if you can visualize it, you will see that this area is light colored, and then we have over here got the normal tissue of the normal color. So this surrounding area is also a part of the liquefactive necrosis, and it contains inflammatory cells and fibrotic tissue. Now, what are the clinical conditions? Common clinical conditions in which we see liquefactive necrosis, it is brain abscess, dental abscess, even the acne which is present on the skin, that also is a liquefactive necrosis. So what happens when you have got what we say pimples on the skin? If you press the pimples, that liquefied material, it comes out. That tiny pus which comes out, it is an example of a liquefactive necrosis. So easy to remember conditions are brain abscess, dental abscess, and acne. Then we come to caseous necrosis. Now, caseous necrosis is characterized by cheesy or granular appearance due to tissue breakdown. So here the important thing is it is cheesy or granular appearance. Etiology, it happens because of the tuberculous infections. So there is this bacteria called as Mycobacterium tuberculosis. Infection by it will lead to caseous type of necrosis. This is a special type of different type of necrosis, and it is also seen in the fungal infections. For example, histoplasmosis. Now, histoplasmosis is a fungal infection which is caused by inhaling of the spores of the fungus Histoplasma capsulatum, and these spores are usually found in bird droppings or bat droppings, and the infection which affects is commonly in the lungs, but it can spread to the other parts of body, and it is particularly seen in the individuals those who have got weakened immune response. Even the tuberculosis infection is also seen in the people who have got weak immune response. The sites which are commonly involved, they are lungs, lymph nodes, or any other part of the body like skin, bones, etc., anywhere, but the commonest one is the lungs and followed by the lymph nodes. Grossly, when we look at caseous necrosis, the tissue appears yellowish and dry, cheese like. So here you see, here caseous necrosis, and if you compare it with, it looks very similar to the cheese. So here we have got a piece of a cheese and it looks as the tissue has become cheese like. So caseous necrosis, caseous word is derived from uh, caseous, which is cheese. So that's why it is called as caseous necrosis or cheese like necrosis. Now, it has also got a very typical microscopic picture in which the affected areas are structureless, eosinophilic, and contain granular debris. So here, this is the affected area. It has become reddish. It's it is eosinophilic, and it is uh, structureless. It becomes homogeneous, and there is a granular debris, and there is formation of what we call as granulomas. So these areas, they contain activated macrophages which are known as epithelial cells. So we have got these activated macrophages known as epithelial cells, and there are giant cells present. And in this particular case, in tuberculosis, we have got Langerhans type of giant cells. These areas, then they are surrounded by rim of lymphocytes and fibrous tissues. So what are the clinical conditions in which just before I proceed further, here we have got what we call as epithelial cells. Now these epithelial cells, here you see, this is the epithelial cells. These are activated macrophages, and when I will be taking up chronic inflammation, at that time I will be discussing these in detail. So we have got group of these slipper shaped cells which we call as epithelial cells, and this is a Langerhans type of giant cell. The characteristic of the Langerhans type of giant cell is that it is a giant cell, it's a big cell, and it has got nuclei on the periphery. They are present in a horseshoe shape. Here we have got another one. Here you see that we have got these nuclei on the periphery in a horseshoe shape. So these are the giant cells, and we have got epithelial cells, and on the rim we have got these large number of these over here. These dark spots, these are all lymphocytes, and we have got this here fibrous tissue. So this is a example of a caseous necrosis. The clinical conditions in which caseous necrosis is seen, they include pulmonary tuberculosis and tubercular lymphadenitis. So pulmonary tuberculosis is seen in the lungs, and tubercular lymphadenitis is seen in the lymph nodes. Then we have got fat necrosis. Fat necrosis occurs when adipose or fat tissue undergoes damage and inflammation due to trauma or enzymatic reactions. So we have got two things. One is the trauma, and other is the enzymatic reactions. So what is the etiology of fat necrosis? The first is the trauma to the fatty tissue. So any trauma or physical injury, if it occurs to a fatty tissue in a body, it will lead to fat necrosis. So what are the sites in a body which are exposed to trauma? One is breast in the females, particularly where a lot of fat tissue is there. Then other areas like thighs, then we have got buttocks or the gluteal region. These areas, if heavy physical trauma occurs there, then it will lead to fat necrosis. And the second etiological cause is enzymatic fat digestions and enzymes which are present in the pancreas. If there is any damage to the pancreas, these enzymes which are present inside the pancreas, they come out, and the surrounding fat, pancreas is present in the peritoneal cavity, and peritoneum, all of you know, it is rich with lots and lots of visceral fat over there. So if these enzymes, particularly fat digesting enzymes, lipases, amylases, etc., when they come out, they are going to digest the fat over there and cause enzymatic destruction or death of the fatty tissue, which is then called as fat necrosis. This leads to this enzymatic digestion of the fat will lead to formation of what we call as calcium soaps, and they are white in chalky white in color, and this process is called as saponification. So if there is enzymatic necrosis of the fat, then we see a process what we call as saponifications. What are the sites involved? The sites involved are breast, gluteal, and thigh region. These are the areas where traumatic fat necrosis occurs, and peritoneal fat, where enzymatic fat digestion due to pancreatic damage occurs. So, grossly, what we see upon gross is that the tissue appears chalky white due to calcium deposits. Here you see that in this region there are present white fatty deposits. What do we see under microscope? In the microscope we see that the adipocytes, they have got cloudy appearance, and they are surrounded by inflammatory reaction. Remember, in necrosis there is always going to be inflammation, or inflammatory cells or the phagocytic cells are always going to be present. If you remember from your histology, if you have seen the fat tissue, it appears as a empty clear spaces inside the cell. This is due to the processing mechanism which we undergo when the tissue is processed to make a slide. All of the fat is dissolved, and so fat cells appear as a very clear roundish areas. But if there is a fat necrosis, then we will see that they become cloudy, or that clearness is lost and they now appear turbid looking over here. So that is the microscopic appearance. What are the clinical conditions? Clinical conditions we have already discussed. One is the traumatic fat necrosis in breast or in gluteal region, and then we have got acute pancreatitis. Acute pancreatitis is a condition in which pancreas becomes inflamed and damaged. So the digestive enzymes which are present in the pancreas, they leak from the pancreatic duct and cause fat necrosis of the surrounding peritoneal region. So there is peritoneal fat necrosis. So that was fat necrosis. Fibrinoid necrosis, which is the last type of necrosis or fifth type of necrosis, it occurs in the blood vessels when immune complexes or antigen antibody complexes, they get deposited in the vessel walls. So it is seen in type 2 or type 3 hypersensitivity reactions. What is the etiology? Common etiology of this is autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, polyarthritis nodosa, and SLE. Now, in polyarthritis nodosa, as the name suggests, poly means many, arthritis means inflammation of the arteries, and there is formation of the nodes around the arteries. So, commonly we call it as PAN. PAN or polyarthritis nodosa. SLE is systemic lupus erythematosus. Again, it is an autoimmune disease in which a lot of things are seen. I have explained about this SLE when I was discussing autoimmune reactions in the etiology of uh, uh, reversible and irreversible cell injury. There I mentioned why SLE is called SLE. Now, another condition in which fibrinoid necrosis it is seen in severe hypertension. So, what are the sites involved? Particularly in fibrinoid necrosis, the tissue which is involved is arterioles or the small arteries of the affected organs. So, fibrinoid necrosis, like fat necrosis, it was seen in the fatty tissue, caseous necrosis, liquifactive necrosis, coagulative necrosis, they were all seen in the varied and large tissues of the body. But fibrinoid necrosis is particularly seen only in the arterioles of the affected organs. And since these are very small vessels and fibrinoid necrosis is present in the walls of the vessels, grossly we are not able to visualize it. I mean, if you are given a small arteriole which a fibrinoid necrosis and a normal arteriole, just by looking it with the naked eyes, you will not be able to tell where which one is involved with a fibrinoid necrosis. So, gross appearance is not possible to describe or define on a uh, in cases of fibrinoid necrosis. But microscopically, yes. Here what we see is it is identified by brightly eosinophilic deposition in the vessel wall. So here we have got a vessel wall, and here you see this region. This is showing a bright eosinophilic or reddish color area in this vessel wall. So this is a example of fibrinoid necrosis, and rest of the surrounding region of the wall there is present inflammation. Again, let me remind you, inflammation is always present in necrosis. What are the clinical conditions? All those etiological conditions are clinical conditions. Vasculitis, which we see in polyarthritis nodosa, rheumatoid arthritis, and in severe hypertension, a condition known as malignant hypertension, which where the blood pressure is very very high. Uh, that is called as malignant hypertension. In such conditions, the arteries or the small arteries or the arterioles, there we see fibrinoid necrosis. One more thing, why do we call it fibrinoid? When in pathology, remember, whenever we add the suffix oid, it means that it is something like that. It's not exactly like that. If you remember from your Down syndrome, there was this condition called as mongoloid faces. The faces, they are like of the Mongols. So the child is not a Mongol, but by looking at its face, it looks as if he is a Mongolian. So that we call it as oid, mongoloid. That means something like Mongol. So here we have the word fibrinoid. So it is not fibrin, but the material which is this bright eosinophilic material, it looks as if it is a fibrin deposited, but it's not fibrin. So it is called as fibrinoid. So this is a small tip. Remember, whenever oid is added, it is not exactly that thing, but it is something like that. So it is a fibrinoid necrosis. That means it's a fibrin like material deposition. So please don't call it as fibrin necrosis. It is a fibrinoid necrosis. So finally, we have covered all the 5 types of necrosis. Let's summarize them. Uh, First, talk about the characteristic coagulative necrosis. Here, the tissue architecture is preserved. The cells are they become ghost cells or they become their own tombstones. In liquefactive necrosis, tissue transform into liquid mass. There is a central cystic cavity in which there is present liquefied material. Caseous necrosis, there is cheese-like appearance. So here we have got name is derived from the cheese. So there is a cheese-like area present. In fat necrosis, there is necrosis of the fatty tissue with saponification, etc. And in fibrinoid necrosis, the there it is seen in the immune reactions and severe hypertension. Now, so here let me mark the important points. Caseous, it is cheese-like. Fibrinoid necrosis, it is seen in immune reaction, and in this coagulative necrosis, the tissue architecture is preserved. Now, etiology, coagulative necrosis, it is ischemia, and then we have got liquefactive necrosis, we have got infection, and important exception over here is that ischemia, although it causes coagulative necrosis, but in brain it will cause liquefactive necrosis. Then caseous necrosis, it is seen in tuberculosis. Fat necrosis, it is seen in trauma and in leakage of the pancreatic enzymes. Fibrinoid necrosis, it is seen in immune complexes diseases, type 2 or type 3 hypersensitivity, and in severe hypertension or malignant hypertension. Sites, coagulative necrosis seen in internal organs except brain, liquefactive necrosis seen in brain as well as other soft tissues of the body, caseous necrosis particularly in lungs and lymph nodes, fat necrosis it is seen in breast, thighs and peritoneal fat, and fibrinoid necrosis it is seen in the arterioles. So gross appearance, coagulative necrosis, the tissue will be firm and opaque and it will be shrunken in the later stages. Liquefactive necrosis, there will be a cystic cavity in the center which is filled with the liquefied material. In caseous necrosis, there will be cheese-like areas, and in fat necrosis, due to saponification, there will be chalky white areas. And fibrinoid necrosis, since it occurs in a very small vessels, it cannot be visualized with the naked eye. Microscopic appearance, coagulative necrosis, cell outlines are preserved. Liquefactive necrosis, cellular architecture is lost. In caseous necrosis, we have what we call as granuloma, and there are present epitheliid. Or see over here again the word oid has come. Like I told you, in fibrinoid there is oid, so epitheliid. So again from the name it is clear that these cells, they are not epithelial cells but they are oid of them. Oid means that they look like epithelial cells but they are not the epithelial cells. So what are epithelioid cells? They are activated macrophages. So macrophages, they are mesenchymal cells. They are not epithelial cells, but their appearance looks like epithelial cells. That's why they are called as epithelioid cells. And then we have got giant cells, and particular giant cells which we see in tuberculosis, they are known as Langerhans type of giant cells. In fat necrosis, microscopically we see that the adipocytes, they have got cloudy cytoplasm and with a surrounding inflammatory reaction. In fibrinoid necrosis, we have got bright eosinophilic fibrin-like depositions in the vessel wall. Clinical example, myocardial infarction in the coagulative necrosis and cerebral infarction or dental abscess or acne in the liquefactive necrosis. Here, I would like to make a mention that we will be taking up gangrene later on. Uh, it is a separate form. Few people add gangrenous necrosis also to this list, a sixth type of necrosis. But gangrene is basically either extension of coagulative necrosis or liquefactive necrosis. If it is a massive coagulative necrosis of a large area, then we call it as dry gangrene. And if it is a massive uh, necrosis of soft tissue leading to liquefactive necrosis, then we call it as wet gangrene. Now, other types of cases we see in tubercular lymphadenitis or histoplasmosis, fat necrosis we see in breast trauma, acute pancreatitis, and fibrinoid necrosis we see in autoimmune diseases and in malignant hypertension. So that finishes with the necrosis.